Welcome, everyone. My name is Larry Bieferman. I want to give special thanks to Amy Armitage, Solange Charis, Miguel Padro, and Tom Kochen for agreeing to participate in this panel, which I think should be a really interesting one. This is my first time I've managed a session, Zoom session, so I apologize in advance for whatever will happen in that regard. Essentially, we're going to have a kind of a Q&A exchange between me and the panelists for about 2/3 of the time, and then we'll be looking to the chat for questions, and we're going to aim to leave a lot of time for questions from the participants as well. So without further ado, I will proceed in those terms. This session is concerned on how C-suite executives have reacted to and might respond to the need for changes at the workplace, particularly as it concerns worker voice issues. In part, what executives perhaps mistakenly think about what their workers experience at and might want from work in light of those, changes which I'll describe. And third, how executives have come to a particular understanding and what bears on the particular views they have and what kind of choices they might make in light of that. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes as a backdrop. I think hopefully will inform the discussion. This is based on sort of my canvas of what I call company side narratives about changes in the workplace context and how that bears on characterizations of how executives view things. So what are the kinds of changes that are featured in these narratives? One relates to population change, racial and ethnic composition of the workforce, obviously the long-going changes in terms of the roles of men and women in the workforce, and what that means in terms of changes with regard to what they bring to the workforce and what they expect of it. And a particular edge or force is given to that in connection with social movements like the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Second change, which is often featured, is generational ones, from the waning baby boomer generation to the millennials to I guess they're called the Zoomers. And the suggestion that as you move forward to the more recent generations, you have different attitudes and expectations with regard to notions of respect for authority, the need for autonomy, the interest in mobility within and across workplaces, the need for a different work-life balance, and concern about how companies behave, quotes, both within the workplace, with respect to workplace, but within the larger society. And then in turn, how do companies respond to that? The third change, which is often alluded to, is what I call large-scale socioeconomic change, both linked to companies individually and how their aggregate impact on the larger society. Quite obviously, gross and continuing inequality in wealth and income, the inability of many workers to sustain themselves from full-time employment, even if it's otherwise available, the lack of or limited access to healthcare, retirement plans, and similar benefits, and then somewhat more broadly, the large and disparate impacts of climate change, degradation of the environment on their lives in general, and how that filters over into a conversation both in the larger society, but in a way bound up with what companies doing about the so-called social contract, the purposes of and values advanced by companies, and then a sort of a mix of notions of sustainable companies, responsible companies, of stakeholder rather than shareholder-oriented companies, that sort of discourse. Fourth, a narrative which we see is so-called information revolution, the ability, both in terms of extent and speed, for workers, among others, to communicate with and among themselves in connection with the workplace, but others outside the workplace. And in turn, the bearing of that on workers' ability and willingness to more forcefully communicate and act on and engage companies about what they want from and with respect to work. And related to that, the ability of workers to gain the attention of other sectors of society, whether it's shareholders, customers, elected officials, or others, and seek their influence or role with regard to changing the dynamics within companies. The fifth is related to technology, the notion that given the nature of the competitive environment, there's a greater demand for changes, significant changes in technology, and faster application of them. That in turn raises questions about changes in the knowledge, skills, abilities, flexibility to respond to, attitudes and behaviors of workers to be able to use or adapt to those technologies or be cast aside because they can't. Related notions about flexibility with regard to how companies operate to incorporate these technologies. And I see links between that and narratives about the greater importance of notions of company, quote, culture, trust, and engagement than otherwise, sort of bound up with these more dramatic changes. And lastly is the COVID pandemic and the, like I say, the greater uncertainty and uncertainty about lots of things, about the availability of work, about the location and the presence of workers at the workplace, issues about the reliability of supply chains, particularly international ones, but also domestic ones, and a related set of issues. So all those, quote, changes seem to characterize the narratives which people who talk about how executives are dealing with the current environment at least shape that. We will see from our panelists how they view the impact of those or other factors. But in essence, well, we'll proceed then to the questions. I'm going to start with Solange Charis from Charis Consulting and HC Moneyball. Solange, your writing and practice focus on senior executives having come to recognize that however easy in prior years it was to recruit the kinds of workers they believe they require for the company to be successful, that's far less the case today. Some executives coming to realize that they need to far better understand what it will take to identify, recruit, and retain such workers. And toward that end, senior executives are becoming increasingly aware of the need to identify and collect information about workers and analyze that in sophisticated ways. So my first question, you can respond to that generally, but my first specific question is, for which kinds of companies and workers do you think senior executives see recruitment as the most challenging issue and why? And especially as that relates to issues of worker voice. Solange?
Thank you, Larry, and I'm delighted to be here and speak to this audience. I think it's an interesting context for a conversation, especially around executive behavior. So I think, the way we frame this is really very interesting. I don't think anyone is blind to the fact that we've had a major disruptive event in the last couple of years that has not only changed the contract between worker and company, worker and employer, but also in the way that workers are viewed as part of the business model. And I think that's the first thing that we need to contextualize is that what you said before, Larry, is that senior executives have been lazy in a sense around workers and labor because it's always been available. And now that it is less available than before, that statement that CEOs and senior executives make about employees being their most important or their most valuable asset is actually coming home to roost. There's always been an assumption that labor is available for any business, and it's been ignored as an essential part of the business model. And I think that is changing now. And I see a trend where more and more organizations are actually reorienting their business models to be more employee or worker centric. That is to say that they are beginning to realize that the worker is the bottleneck, is the limitation on their competitive advantage, because they don't have workers to produce the work, right? Or to deliver the services. It's in close second to supply chain, right? So we're now seeing two big disruptive events for organizations: getting labor that actually is skilled and can produce results, and the supply chain, getting the input in terms of material and the distribution part of the supply chain. So these two things, it feels a little bit like a tsunami, right? Or like the perfect storm that organizations are having to deal with multiple things, multiple challenges at the same time. So I think what's happening is that executives are beginning to see that workers are not just a resource that's unlimited, that it's not fungible, that it is core to their business. And they're also adjusting the way that they're integrating that. So what do we see? We see the Great Resignation, which I like to call as the Great Reset. And we're also seeing a great convergence, right? So it's not just we don't have the labor, but our customers are now paying attention to things like worker welfare and pay equity in their decisions to consume organizations' products.
Can I step in though? So could you, I am unmuted. Just fast forward then to, so could you, on the executive side of the equation, and how are they reacting in terms of what they're doing in terms of, especially as it relates to your work, in terms of what are they trying to learn and how?
Well,
To respond to this.
Sure. So the big thing that we are seeing is an increase in the use of human capital analytics to actually understand these trends, so that we are not being influenced, or organizations or executives are not being influenced by the squeaky wheel, that they're actually using data and data analytics to base their inputs or their insights, business insights, more in the aggregate of the labor challenge than at the individual level. And I think that's really important. And, you know, I'm going to show what kind of a nerd I am, but it's like Star Trek, where Spock says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And the other thing that supports that is higher level of sophistication in human capital analytics approaches and tools and technology.
Can you give us a couple, give the attendees sort of a quick feel for the kind of tools or methods that are being used?
Yeah, so like every other part of the organization, every other function, like financial functions, sales, marketing, operations, we're using math, we're using data and data analytics in a more sophisticated way to not only understand single events in the organization, like attrition or like engagement, but using analytics to understand the relationship between them, because HR is not a single variate function, it is a multivariate function. So you can look at things like the relationship between attrition and engagement, training and retention. And one of the big messages that I hope the audience will get from this is that when we think about employee voice, we're not necessarily talking about doing a survey to understand how employees feel, but we are looking at the artifact of employee voice in other indicators. Employees vote with their feet. When you have high attrition, that's them telling you something. That's employee voice. So it's not necessarily understanding what employees are thinking and feeling when you survey them.
So it's what kind of tools, again, can you just illustrate for the attendees sort of in terms of the information gathering beyond the engagement survey or something like that,
So,
last survey, what's the method for executives understanding what they think they need to understand about their workers?
right. So there are HRIS systems out there. There are providers like Workday and ADP that can help with aggregating the data. And then there are products such as mine, which will allow you to understand the relationship of trends in that data. So once you aggregate the data, you can begin to correlate or drag and drop and test your hypothesis of the relationship between, let's say, attrition and training, or attrition and enterprise level performance profitability, or training and HCROI, or tenure and HCROI, HCROI being human capital return on investment, which is what the investors are looking at. They want to understand that. To understand employee voice, there are lots of tools, there are lots of providers out there that will help with getting surveys done for you. There's Burning Glass, there's Today's Mood. So there are lots of providers out there that will help you. The trick is to take that information and really understand what the root cause of the trends that you're seeing in the organization as an expression of employee voice. So less engagement, lower tenure, higher attrition. That's the employees telling you something. And you don't want to get to the point where you have attrition before you start listening. So you can look at things like what the employees want. The big, and this is the last point I'm going to make, and I'm going to let the rest of the panelists speak. The big, the big misconception is that executives have, is that employees just want to earn more money. And that's what happened in the Great Resignation, that companies were actually throwing money at employees, and it wasn't staunching the departure because they're out of touch with what employees want. And that's what we need to start listening to. And we know that because employees are telling us they don't want money, they want quality of life, or they want opportunity, and organizations aren't giving it to them. So that's a way that voice is being sort of ignored by executives, but they're waking up to that. And again, they're waking up to it because employees are demanding it, because investors are demanding it, and because consumers are demanding that companies hear their employees' voice and respond to it.
Well, I want to turn to Amy. And I think this connects with part of what Solange is saying.
Yeah.
In your writing and other activities, you've taken note of a recent significant focus on the importance of companies' culture to their success. So can you talk about what is meant by that, and in that context, in which, how that links up in senior leaders' minds with notions of workers' voice and understanding what workers want and what's expected of them?
Okay. I'm thrilled to be talking about culture and really the business opportunity of worker voice, but I want to take a little bit of a back step here and say, what is effective worker voice? And yes, it has to do with empowering workers, being represented, valued, engaged. We know that's critical, but there's another important element, less discussed. And I think that's the potential of worker voice to contribute to the business. Or said differently, the potential of human capital to build business value. And when we talk about culture and when we talk about business opportunity, it's important to think about this potential. As Solange suggested, we're facing record levels of workforce disengagement and turnover. And it's not just frontline workers. It's happening despite the focus by HR departments on employee experience and employee listening and deploying various workforce arrangements and, much more. And clearly power is shifting to employees. Most employees get that, and most people get that. You've mentioned the demographic shifts. But I also think, we need to focus a little bit more on the basic economics, and old ideas die hard. I grew up in the 60s. My father was the CEO of an industrial paint company in Newark, New Jersey. The Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union were a fairly strong union, and he fought the unions tooth and nail all his life while undergoing race riots in Newark in the late 60s. And, the management labor relationship was a constant source of turmoil, stress, fear, until he retired at an early age at 65. But flash forward, we're in a radically different economy where market value is derived not from physical assets like industrial paint factories, but from human capital. from knowledge and service workers, from innovation, patents, teams, and social networks. And that's, I think, at the heart of where culture is right now, Larry. And
how would that translate, though? I want to understand, how does that translate into, therefore, what literally executives think about what they need to know and or do, particularly as it might relate to voice? If you could sort of.
Well, I think what that really means is that leaders have to be on top of their culture. So yes, you need to measure culture. You need to have indicators of culture. You need to have indicators of whether there's trusting relationships. And we can measure all of these things with indicators. But I also think that at the end of the day, doing a survey once or twice a year may not be enough. We really have to get into the organization. Senior leaders need to be coached on what it does. What does it mean to create purpose in an organization? What does it mean to motivate employees? And I think one of the reasons why coaching has exploded is because we've seen a real shift in the kinds of leaders we need to build an open culture, to build a culture where there's psychological safety, where there's not fear of speaking up. We call it a speak up culture, where you can actually work effectively in diverse teams, where you can tap your executive networks more broadly. And I think that this whole idea of culture, in its simplest form, is the way we get things done around here. It's values, beliefs, and behavior. And executives need to be modeling that, but they don't always know what good looks like. And sometimes they need the perspective and feedback from the outside in order to really build better leadership behaviors across the organization and through their programs.
I want to pick that up on Miguel. So connect that up. We talked about this before in our preparatory sessions, but sort of your experience with the Aspen Institute Initiatives of Worker Voice sort of picks up on the seeming contradiction. Maybe things are in changes. Maybe Solange and Amy is suggesting that there's a large gap between what senior leaders think they understand about their workers and what their workers think about their own experience. So can you offer us whether that characterization is correct or fair? And second, what's the source of that?
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And hello, everybody. Really honored to be chatting with you today. That's a really complicated question, Larry. And it's hard to unpack because there are lots of moving parts to this equation, both on the worker side and on the executive side. And I would extend it, the focus on executives is important, but we also need to understand that long chain between executives and workers is also extremely complicated. And there are lots of gaps there where signals from the front line of the workforce can just fall into a black hole. And so we have big picture. Today, we have workers who are weighing in on this massive variety of issues. For some workers, it's pocketbook issues and my own family's financial security. That's part of the equation, but it's almost never the entire thing. There's social issues. There's kind of values alignment with different issues that the company is speaking up on, or that executives are speaking up on, or how the company shows up in our community. There are all these dimensions that workers have tools now to weigh in on via social media or other truly like worker-centered tools. So there's that, where there's just many issues that management is not very well equipped to receive signals from the workforce. So there's this tool problem as well amidst this really vast universe of issues that workers are going to speak up on, that matter to them deeply, and that will influence then the company's response to those will then influence how the worker views leadership, whether they trust their managers and all of that. There's the other piece of this, though, is really around the management tools, or the lack of management tools, to truly engage and understand worker sentiment, worker insight, worker knowledge, including this could be direct business knowledge, about opportunities to improve our supply chain or our operational processes. But it could be other things too that speak more to the cultural dimensions that Amy was talking about. So there's, especially in the United States, our management culture has been allowed to stay quite primitive. We haven't had to develop a lot of tools because our management culture is largely shielded from pressure from workers. And so there's policy dimensions here that are complicated as well. And so we have a ton of issues that workers care about, and we have very few tools to receive signals and to process signals. And then in the middle, we have very long chains of hierarchy in an organization where at any point, if someone doesn't communicate up from the front line, all of that insight is lost. And so it's just this very rich area of folly, I think, in some ways, where we haven't developed that. And I think a lot of executives have been caught flat-footed, really believing that the old model of if we do lots of nice stuff for our employees, then we're a good employer. And that just doesn't seem to hold anymore. I think like the Starbucks examples now of unionization at Starbucks is a really interesting example of that, where, you know, for the last 20 years, I would definitely say Starbucks is on the spectrum of employers been seen as pretty good, and they still are. But they now have, I think, over 180 stores that have union drives now. And it's not because they're a terrible employer, it's that their employees see areas for improvement, and management's caught flat-footed because all the nice things that they've done, they're shocked that all the nice things that they've done for their employees aren't being recognized, and that's not enough. And so there's just this very big gap of expectations and tools, I think, between the front line and the executive suite.
I want to pick up with this with Tom, sort of twofold. You've in our pre-session talked about sort of the obstacles to challenges in terms of executives taking a different approach, whether it's in terms of personal disincentives. If you appear pro-union or maybe pro-worker voice, that's not something which might be terribly popular among peers, might have career implications. I wonder if you could just, from your experience or understanding, whether it's, I'll call them the social, psychological, or institutional obstacles, A, and B, what do you see out there in terms of alternative, I'll call approaches and modalities to change that, whether originating from the company side of the equation or from the worker side of the equation? Tom.
Well, thanks, Larry, and thanks for organizing this great session, and to all my colleagues on this panel. I think you've set up these questions that Larry just posed very nicely. I think it's a possibly historic moment, and it's calling for real soul searching on the part of executives, just as you have said. You know, and as Miguel emphasized, you know, the CEOs and their HR advisors and even their anti-union consultants have all grown up in a generation where they've had the power, and they've been insulated from strong upsurge in employee voice that we're hearing today. And so now they have to ask themselves, well, can we just use our old playbook of saying, we will control it from the top, we'll collect all the data, we'll manage to change our culture, we'll lead from the executive suite, or do we have to have a different managerial approach? And that is, we have to actually listen to and take into account what workers are telling them. What are they telling them? And you've all emphasized it, that there's a broad array of issues. Certainly bread and butter issues are important to some, but values of the company and issues of work life balance and so on, all of these are the modern issues of the workforce, and you can't address them from the top down alone. Yes, it needs leadership, but it needs leadership that says, we are going to engage the workforce in a constructive way. We're going to listen to them. We're going to respect their rights to organize and to challenge us. And we're going to find new ways to deal with it. That's the issue that's on the table today. Very few executives are ready to engage that, but I think events are getting ahead of themselves. And so the playbook from the past is not going to work with this labor force. And it's up to progressive leaders and their advisors and their HR consultants to help them find a new path forward that really does respect worker rights and engages them as equals in this process.
Well, so following up on that, I was trying to sort of call, is this sort of a transition required? That is, again, in the first instance, there may be in regard to a move toward unionization of a particular company. We have the typical kinds of responses, which in part reflect understandings and attitudes, which is historical ones. And one question is sort of what's the path towards something different? And this may seem like a small change, but I sort of puzzle about this. I mean, I look at when the State Street Global Advisors did in its investor related work engagement about worker voice related issues and company responses. They talked about anything from company directors meeting with workers, having board committees which are focused on workplace issues and engaging corporate executives more directly on that. Corporate executives meeting, quote, meeting, engaging workers in other ways. Are there sort of transitional or intermediate things that at least change the equation in terms of changing the executives' understanding of, again, who workers are and what they want?
Let me just tell you what workers are saying on those issues. Yes, workers want more of a voice at the workplace on operational issues, on value issues, in collaborative processes. They also want a stronger voice at the corporate level. And so our surveys, national surveys, show that workers do want to have a voice at the corporate board, either on the board itself or in other ways. They also want a voice with power in collective bargaining. So it's not either or today. Today, it's a broader range of mechanisms. And so your idea of let's take one step at a time, I think is right. But you have to, in fact, recognize that it can't be just top down. It has to listen to what your particular constituency of workers is saying they want, and then find ways. So, you know, the workers at Alphabet, the Alphabet Workers Union, they are very clear that they wanted board representation. They didn't get it, but they did get some other responses, and that's going to continue. And so some workers are saying we want a union, and they're going to pursue that. But then it's up to management to get the kind of union that works in their organization and to work in partnership with them. So it's not that we can choose for workers what they want. We have to engage them and shape together mechanisms. And they could be some of these intermediaries. Some of that's questionable in terms of legality, but I think companies will have to innovate and then call for legislative change if that's what's needed to allow new forms to emerge, along with real collective bargaining where that's what workers want.
We only have a few minutes before we want to turn to questions. What I'd like to do is go back to Amy and Solange and Miguel and back to Tom. If you could sort of, whatever sort of closing observations you would want, though if you could focus a little bit on sort of, again, holding aside the immediate contention over unionization at a company, what play do you see for other kinds of modalities for executives coming to a different view about worker voice?
Okay.
Amy first, and Solange, and then Miguel, based on your.
You know, I
do have to be big steps.
I absolutely believe, Tom, you're exactly right that there has to be more of the bottoms up process underway. And, you know, we see repeatedly when workers have the voice that it works, that there's a business opportunity there to improve productivity, to improve operations, to improve innovation. But I do also think we need a foundation that governs the enterprise. So this might include rules around privacy and people data. We also need to be measuring and managing the value of our human capital and what it contributes to the bottom line. So having more disclosure and transparency around things like investments in training, skill development, DEI, health, safety, well-being, culture, and other determinants of financial performance. These things are linked. If we disclose them, if we're more transparent about them, if we drive data downward in organizations, we're going to have stronger organizations and more performance. So I think that's my final comments really are about, we need to be working both from the top down and the bottoms up to really drive performance in organizations.
Solange?
And I agree with Amy, obviously. And to get there, there has to be systemic change. And I believe that the change has to be a reframing or a reorientation of the business model to really value and put in an appropriate position, which is central to the business model, the impact and the contribution of workers. Because if you don't have that as a philosophy and a business model, there is no road, there's no pathway, there's no impetus, there is no incentive for management to actually respond to the needs of the employees, because they're going to see it as a secondary to the business model instead of primary to the business model. And again, there are so many more pressures, not just endogenous pressures, pressures from inside, but exogenous pressures from investors, as Amy said, for transparency, from customers to ensure that they are doing business with companies that value and respect and take care of their workers. And this is the perfect time for worker voice to emerge, because it's not just a single path. It's not just the workers saying they want more voice. It's the customers and the investors saying we have to pay attention to the workers. So I think, I said before, we're in this perfect storm. Now is the time to take action. And I think that management would be smart to view the worker as a partner, not as an adversary. And I think that shift has to occur as well.
Miguel, you and the Aspen Institute have had this project on worker voice, and you spent a bit of time engaging executives. So how do you see the path forward?
Yeah,
easy, to say the least.
So there's just huge opportunity to develop a lot of new innovations. We are starting from such basic, from such a remedial point that there's just massive opportunity for innovation. We're looking at
a couple of examples would be helpful.
Yeah, we're looking at different ways at the governance level. So certainly at the board level and things like that. Different things that we could do at that level that wouldn't necessarily mean worker representation on boards, but like that's one option. But even advisory boards to the board of directors, like worker advisory boards that speak to the board of directors regularly, creating new kind of habits and rituals inside the company where the board engages directly with worker representatives. There are things as wild as giving kind of non-binding referenda to workers on mergers and acquisitions. And heck, why don't we do that with say on pay votes that shareholders get? Those aren't binding either, but why don't you give workers a chance to actually weigh in on those kinds of things? But I think the smaller kind of bite-sized change that's small on the surface but huge is less governance and more management. And if we can redesign management kind of roles, and I'm not talking senior management, I'm talking the middle and lower tiers of management, to allow those managers enough time and resources and kind of promotion incentives. Make sure that as you're promoting people up the chain in your management culture, that a big part of that is how well they have kind of translated worker concerns. If they can demonstrate that, make that part of the promotional system. LinkedIn actually does this. And I remember visiting LinkedIn a number of years ago, and it's remarkable how they do this. You can't get promoted at LinkedIn unless you demonstrate a certain number of examples of where you helped someone else in the company achieve greater economic opportunity, because LinkedIn's mission is creating economic opportunity for the world. So that kind of alignment is really fascinating to me as a management practice. And that's something that's within the realm of possibility, I think, for companies. And I think that would mean a lot.
Tom, I'm going to give you the last word before we go to questions. Either two things I'll call, if you want to offer Tom's advice to executives.
My advice to executive is listen to the workforce. Don't think that you've got the answers or that your HR people will have the answers, because they have no experience in this generation of working with workers as independent agents and partners. And so if you want to partner with the workforce, listen to what they're telling you. And then as my colleagues on this panel have all said, let's find ways to do that. But you can't control it from the top.
All right, great. I'm open to questions. I wasn't sure if I have it in the chat, but if someone wants to indicate so or speak up. Okay, Greg Bamber.
Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm speaking
Yep.
to you from Europe at the moment, and I think it's a very important and interesting session that you've got together. So congratulations to all of you for raising these vital questions. And I just wonder if any of you involved on this panel have looked at international experiences or see any relevant international experiences that may be adapted or that you might learn from in the US. The discussion, forgive me, has been very US centric up to now, understandably enough, but there are examples from other countries and dare I say some of the regulation in other countries, some of the corporate practice tries to promote more formal approaches to encouraging vocal voice.
Time is short, so Tom, I think we got the point. Excuse me, Greg. Tom, you want to first address that very briefly, and if the rest of the panel wants to weigh in on that. Tom?
Well, I think it's hard for American corporate executives to look to international examples, but I think they have to. And they're getting some pressure from ESG groups and other investors, and they're getting pressure from customers. So I think works councils, while we've got to figure out how to make them viable in the United States, and board representation, but also sometimes even at the sectoral level, there are some things that can be done to address these issues. So it's time to look internationally, and we have to open up executives' eyes to the relevance of those options.
Amy, brief comment, reaction on that? Do you see anything about the broader international experience relevant to executives thinking, American executives thinking?
Yes, in fact, I just read this morning, there was something from Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, and he was citing his experience in international markets. And what he said was quite fascinating in the blog. And it said, we have to recognize that we have far more learning ahead of us than behind us. So he was kind of acknowledging that this is a global new world order, and that we have to be listening and learning and adapting to change. And it's a really interesting, if you just Google the Microsoft blog, you'll see it. But CEOs are just beginning to see the shift. And he cited his experience with work councils, by the way. I think he ran international operations there.
Solange, very briefly.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Amy and I have a little bit of the same experience. My father was also a business owner and had 4 unions in his shop, including the Teamsters, and it was always adversarial. But in Europe, it's not like that. And having worked and lived in Europe and actually been a member of an executive union in Italy, it's a whole different relationship between unions and enterprises, companies that we can learn from. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It can be a partnership where both parties, both entities benefit. And we just need to change our mindset that it's, you know, not a bad, unions aren't a bad thing. And if you look in the history of the United States, unions created our middle class, which is shrinking precipitously. And maybe it's time for another union wave to help our economy, to help our people. And I think we need to change that embedded mindset. And maybe the next generation of CEOs and leaders that are going to be, you know, the Gen Xers and the millennials will be less, you know, adversarial to unions like the baby boomers are, you know, the
Larry, if I can give an example of how
Yes,
we
please
might
do,
address
yeah.
this. A concrete example. A number of us have created what we call a worker empowerment research network. And we're going to have a major report that will come out next Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on how we get it out. But it basically calls for multi-stakeholder conversations about this. It chronicles and catalogs all of the organizing and worker activities that are going on out there. And that's only to set up a conversation. We need national dialogue, business, labor, advocacy groups, people who have been left out of those conversations. This isn't just a big labor management confab. It's got to be really a multi-stakeholder conversation. And we need to host those. And we need to bring people like the people on this panel together with executives and help them understand that there are new forms of organizing, new forms of labor management relations, new forms of worker empowerment and engagement that are possible in this country. And then together we can call for whatever legislative changes down the road might be needed. But let's forget about the legislative change right now. Let's just encourage experimentation, encourage an understanding of what can be done. And let's not have CEOs just talk to each other or HR people talk to each other. That's a waste of time and it's dysfunctional. Or labor leaders just talk to each other. Let's get them into forums, and we're happy to host those to really have candid discussions of what's possible. That's where we need to go. And I think there's a thirst for this within some parts of the business community. The initial conversations we've had with some investors say that it's time for this. So I think right now we need to host more of those kinds of forums.
That sounds terrific. I hope, again, we can have follow up from among the participants and beyond that. Bridget Clough?
Close enough, sure.
I'm sorry.
But no, it's fine. It's Clough, tough Clough.
I'm sorry,
And actually,
a
Tom,
very brief statement at this point, but please.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Tom may have actually answered my question. I'm stuck in a conundrum of an executive leadership that's been called tone deaf and employees that are being kind of chalked up to COVID effect, meaning their requests or demands. And so I was kind of curious to know about that predicament, right? Because a lot of these requests, some of them are actually legitimate and some of them actually are COVID, which we can't have any impact on, right? So I was just curious for any comments.
Tom, you want to have a quick response or no?
My sense, and I defer to my colleagues, I think the COVID has amplified the voice, and it's provided a release point for it. All these pressures were there beforehand. They got intensified by the difficulties of COVID. Now we have an opportunity to take that pivotal set of events, and that now that it's on the surface, to deal with both the COVID need for flexibility and how we're equitably bringing people back to work and allowing for different kinds of scheduling arrangements, but also dealing with the deeper underlying pressures that were there and that will continue to be there as we come back to work. So I think COVID gives us an opening to address these issues, but the pressures are deeper.
Can I build on that, Larry, real quick?
Yours is the last comment, and then we'll have to close it down. Please.
Okay. Bridget, I think it's a really interesting question. I would try to reframe the problem a little bit. I think that's a great opportunity. Even if it's something that your company can't, your management team doesn't feel like we can address directly, it's still a great opportunity to demonstrate an ability to a willingness to engage and see if the workers who are raising that can help you work with them to come up with some kinds of solutions that they feel would have an impact. Lean in. I think these are really good opportunities to lean into the leadership that your workers are showing. When they're speaking up, it's hard to do, and they're showing leadership by doing it, and embrace that. I think that's something that is a really good opportunity. And I think, unfortunately, the kind of traditional business posture on these things is to view it as agitation or just kind of leaning out. And I think if we just lean in a little bit more, we'll surface something. We're going to surface goodwill. We're going to surface maybe some interesting solutions. Maybe your management team will discover a little, some opportunity that they didn't recognize before, just by honoring it and taking it seriously. So I'd say lean into it a little bit and see if those workers can engage with you and actually come up with a solution to the things that are bothering them.
Well, again, I want to thank Solange and Amy and Miguel and Tom for a really fascinating, informative discussion a small start on a very, very complex, but a very important subject. And I look forward to follow up within the context of LYRA and otherwise. Again, thank you all participants for your sitting in. Take care.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I thought that was a good dialogue, and
Yeah,
I hope we
fun.
can follow up, and we need to bring these different interest groups together.
Yep.
That hasn't happened, and it won't happen just by bringing them together in Washington. It's got to happen within an industry,
Grassroots level.
within
Yep.
sectors, because every sector is a little bit different and has different problems and different demographics of the workforce. But we've got to start that process, and I'm committed to hosting those through this network, and we can host them at MIT, and we can work
That'd
with
be great.
Aspen, and we can work with other groups to do it, but it's got to be cross stakeholders.
Yep. I'm in. Count me in and my
All
data
right.
analytics.
Good. We will.
Totally into.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, we'll keep it going.
We'll
Thank
help
you,
to
everyone.
market it. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Good
Bye.
on you. Cheers.
Hi, Wilma. You're muted. I can't hear you.
I meant to log out. I will see you later.
I was going to say Jim is supposed to be coming, but for Cornell Press.
Oh, no, I was in the last session. I just forgot to log out.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. All right. Have a good day.
You too.